and we are going to talk about regenerative grazing and all sorts of good stuff about cattle and whatnot. So I'm gonna literally just turn it over to you and let you have the floor, and I'm really looking forward to a great discussion. So
yeah. Well, I thankfully brought people smarter than me to talk about that. Two people I've been working closely with for the past 9 months. Travis is a producer we work with over at Soilworks. He's the CEO of one of our companies called Grazing Lands. He was a great ecologist over at the Gates Foundation before he decided to come back to Texas and take over his family ranch, Parker Creek Ranch. So I thought it's always great to have a producer explain what it's actually like to do things on the farm. And Sam is the CEO of a startup in Australia called FarmLab. It's really all about democratizing, I guess, farm data and kind of improving measurement quality and making it easier for farmers to own their data. He'll get more into that. But to start, I thought it'd be helpful for Travis to explain what regenerative grazing is, why producers do it, and why producers don't do it. Because I feel like on the crop side, things are pretty well defined. There's a series of practices. But for grazing, it's a little bit queasier. It's not linear. It's not as well thought out. Well, actually not thought out, as well explained, generally speaking.
Thanks, Kevin. Well, it sounds like I'll be honest with you all. I didn't really do my homework and ask Kevin the background on this group, so I don't really know what everybody's background is. But so I'll give you kind of the layman's terms of what regenerative grazing is and the goals and benefits of it. And so basically, you can take any kind of livestock. And I'm specifically speaking of ungulates, so hooved animals, and excluding pigs would probably be excluded from what I would consider regenerative grazing. But taking them and utilizing what we call either amp grazing or MIG grazing, and it's just kind of like the term when you guys were asking about what's the best term to call regenerative. There's about 20 different ways to talk about regenerative grazing, if that's what we all want to call it tonight, right? So, and different methods, and all these people have coined these different terms, starting with Alan Savory back in the 1970s, all the way until now. What we do with our operation and what we consider regenerative grazing is typically using cattle and utilizing whatever kind of technology in regards to fencing and water systems that we need to implement to bring the cattle into a smaller space. So we call that density. We put them at a higher stocking density and focused on the timing of that density and the movement of those cattle. So and look, the whole goal is when you put the cattle at high density like that, not only is it better for the grasses and stuff like that, but you can use it as an ecological tool to do some really cool stuff with the vegetation. For example, if you have a wooded or brushy area, you can use the cattle at a higher density, leave them in there a little longer, and if you do it frequently enough, it'll turn it back into sort of a grassland savanna ecosystem over a period of time. The soil health benefits, of course, are sort of self-explanatory, but the idea is to replicate what the bison or the wildebeest, for example, do in the African savanna. But specifically the bison in North America, even though, interestingly, everybody refers to the bison, but we've actually lost most of the grasses that were here when the bison were here in large numbers. Those have all been replaced by mostly exotic invasive species from Africa. So interestingly enough, and especially so in Texas, we probably should be referring to the wildebeest and large ungulate herds in Africa more so than the bison. But the idea is to concentrate that animal manure and urine, and then of course they're pushing down with their hooves the biomass onto the surface of the soil, And all of that action and urine and dung helps activate the microbial spectrum right there on top of the soil. That's what really is taking everything on the surface and bringing it below to the root mass of the plant. And then it has sort of this symbiotic relationship with the plants where they move minerals and water and all sorts of things back and forth. And there's millions of these microbes. There's probably several million unknown species. We've only even recorded, I think, like 10,000 or something like that to science. And then, of course, you're ultimately pulling that carbon deeper into the soil stratas up to, well, however deep the root system goes, actually. So another benefit of this type of grazing is we can time the rest periods, which is extremely important for plant vigor and extremely important for carbon sequestration as well. If you continuously graze plants, you can imagine here's the top of the plant and the fullest potential is down here. It's equivalent basically to the top of the plant or more. Big blue stem, for example, is a native species to the Americas, North America specifically. It can have a root system of over 20 feet deep. So you can imagine this grass that's grazed aggressively for a half-day period or a one-day period, and then it's let be for full recovery for 180 days, for example, where we are here. And so you're allowing that root system to stay healthy below the ground. If you continuously graze it, you'd be lucky if that root system went 3 feet. So by doing that type of grazing also, you're giving the plants a rest period that they need to sequester that carbon deep into the soil as well. I think the second question that you had, Kevin.
So like why would producers do this? But I guess more importantly, why would producers not decide to do this? Like what are the barriers?
Well, let's start with the positives, right? And so these are the two big questions that we all really think about in this space a lot. Myself in particular. I had to approach, when I started my first business in this field, my first grazing business, it was pretty shy on capital. So economics was a top priority for me. And I would say that for 99% of grazers that are really serious about switching over to this type of method, economics is first and foremost reason. It has very little to do with their philosophy about soil health. I would say that's a very small group of people that come at this from a soil health approach. Everybody that I know of mostly comes at it from an economic approach. And the reason being is because most of the data suggests that in a normal environment, so average rainfall, if you took the whole entire United States, is 38 inches. So if you take an environment below that 38 inches, you can probably double your stocking rate, if not maybe double and a half. In higher rainfall environments, you can triple or quadruple your stocking rate. So you're essentially running the same amount of animals with the same amount of overhead and all those other factors. Your direct costs will probably even become lower because at scale, typically our direct costs come down. And so the economics are very favorable. It's the number one reason to switch over to this. I would say number two is if you're looking at it from a long-term perspective on land management and the continuation of that land's health, that would be the second reason. So soil health. I had a good conversation with Will Harris yesterday at the conference, and many of you might know the research that's come off of his farm at White Oak Pastures. It's the most referred to carbon sequestration research until this date. I would say our data that's going to come out of the grassroots carbon will be the most valuable data set in the United States here shortly. In fact, it may be one of the most valuable data sets in the world up until this point on carbon sequestration potential from regenerative grazing specifically. And Will Harris told me at a conference in St. Louis, Missouri several years ago, he said, you know, I could have made a lot more money staying in conventional farming. He said, I can show you the numbers that when I was a conventional cattleman and we fed cattle and we grew crops to feed them, we made a lot more money. And he said, I'm X number of $1 million in debt into this regenerative thing. He had been going at it for about 8 years at this point. And he said he had to drink a bottle of wine every night just to go to sleep because he was worried about losing the farm. But he said, I see the long game here with this regenerative switch. And he said, I could see that we were destroying the soil and the ecology of our farm. And that if we continued down this path for decades more, it might not be here. It might not be viable anymore, the conventional agriculture that they were doing. So I think that's the second reason is the soil health and the greater ecological health of the individual farms. I would say that, and by the way, on the economics, it's not because there's opportunities in niche markets really to sell these animals. The demand really, quite honestly, isn't there yet. It's growing considerably. But even if you're a conventional cattleman selling your livestock by conventional means, it's still going to be a huge economic bonus for you if you can increase your stocking rate 2 or 3-fold. The next part of the question as to why people don't adapt this, there's not a lot of data on this to back up what I'm saying. So most of it is anecdotal evidence, being part of this for the past 13 years. From my experience, I would say the number one is knowledge. Okay. and that's kind of with all things in life, it's really hard to make change without knowing how. Interestingly, in the landowner space, and in particularly the ranching space, you got to understand that land ownership and ranching are two different things. Okay, you're in a real estate business as a landowner, and the ranching is a business within itself. So there are not a lot of people left who know how to make ranching a viable business, quite honestly. And then beyond that, the knowledge to implement these kind of systems, and I say systems because conventional agriculture, whether it's row crop farming or growing cattle in a conventional manner, is a very linear thought process. It's a very linear business model. And when it comes to regenerative, it's a systems thinking type of model. And that is really hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. And so adaptation becomes very difficult to do. I'm thinking just, out loud when you have, like, for our foreman, for one of our ranches, I need somebody who's an outside of the box thinker. And that doesn't sound like it's a hard thing to do, right? But to find somebody that's an outside of the box thinker that wants to work in the agriculture industry and specifically on a ranch is more difficult than you would believe. And so the knowledge is probably number one. Number two, it's a capital intensive business to be in if you're at scale, or at any kind of scale, to be quite honest with you. I was talking to a producer yesterday who had 50 acres. And even with 50 acres, he's been at it for 2 years, and he just couldn't believe the amount of capital it required to get his small little regenerative, vegetable operation / poultry operation off the ground, right? And so the amount of capital needed to start these kinds of businesses, and especially at scale like what we're doing with Grazing Lands, is huge. And unfortunately, the return on investment is relatively low compared to other industries, particularly if you guys come from a tech background. It's pennies on the dollars that you guys make. as far as ROIs, right? So it's hard to get the only capital available is either banks, and they don't really want to work with people in agriculture. And most of the banks require that you go to the federal government, i.e. the USDA Farm Service Agency, and get a guaranteed loan through one of their programs. And up until now, there are new ways of getting funding. I would dare argue that to fund something like what I'm doing with Grazing Lands, you're going to have to work directly with capital investors. You are not going to be able to work with, some of these newer tech, type funding things sprouting up. So capital is another big one, and I would say number three, the last one that comes to my mind right now is it is not easy work. It is hard work. Somebody will have to go out and move the cows 3 or 4 times a day and set up fence and check the water and work the cattle when they get sick and all these other things. So it is a more labor intensive type of cattle operation than your conventional agriculture is. Now that's speaking specifically to beef cattle production. Dairy production is probably not much different, honestly. So Kevin, I think I hit most of the
You hit everything. Yeah.
I probably missed something. So
Yeah. Also, if anyone ever has any questions, feel free to jump in. But Sam, you come from Australia. You've done a lot of more of these carbon grazing projects and ecosystem service stuff that should potentially shift the economics on the ranch and on the farm. So I just love for you to talk a little bit about what these ecosystem service credits are for grazing in particular, and how the sausage is made there, so to speak. Sure. I think folks are generally aware of carbon credits and kind of the hype that they're getting, but for grazing, it's a slightly weird process.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks everyone for having an Australian in the midst. So I'm based just about 6 hours drive north of Sydney. We're kind of in sort of the north, I don't know, sort of northwest of New South Wales, if anyone knows sort of New South Wales in Australia. We're quite close, actually. I'll talk in regen context, where if you're familiar with the Wilmot Cattle Co., who sold their carbon credits recently to Microsoft, big deal here in the regen space in Australia. We are about an hour away from them, so we work quite closely with them. In fact, they're one of our clients with the software, which is great. And so I'll talk today sort of probably with a little bit of the Australian experience, but I might just quickly start with a 30-second intro in as far as sort of why what we're doing and why we're doing it. So we started the business in 2016 off the hypothesis that if farmers had better soil data, they would better manage soil carbon. And I was very naive. I don't have, unlike Travis, and a few really interesting points you touched on there, Travis, which I'll pick up on, especially on the data front. Because unlike Travis, I didn't have a family farm to go to. I kind of came from a sort of techish background. I was like, what can I do to sort of help? And I'd seen the Ellen Savory TED Talk, and I really enjoyed that. And I was just like, what can we do to help mitigate climate change and use agricultural soils to do so? Saw a real opportunity there. And it came down to the data piece, because I scratched the surface. I said, why isn't every farmer doing this? There is clearly a huge economic benefit, as Travis has just described. But you also outlined a problem there, Travis, which was, you didn't have the data. We don't have the data, great data sets to prove this, and this is a really fundamental challenge, right? And so we looked at all of this, and I'll just get a quick show of hands if I could. Who's done a soil test before? Put your hand up if you got your camera on. Yeah, great. Yeah, most of us, right? And I mean, how hard was it to do and sort of get the results mapped back? And I know there are some technologies out there. Well, actually, leave your hand up if you use technology to take that soil sample. So a mobile app or something. No. Okay. And this is such commonplace around just around Australia and around the US as well, at least in our experience. And so we sort of we really dived into that problem. We said, well, how do we make it both easy for somebody to collect a soil sample, and also because if we could make it easy, we could also digitize it and make it so that you can come back to the results and have a look at them over time and do stuff with them. Now, we kind of came to the market with this sort of problem in mind, and it wasn't a great commercial problem, because at the end of the day, most of the farmers we were working with were just more interested in chucking on fertilizer than they were looking at the slow changes in soil organic carbon over time. And it wasn't until, probably not until the last couple of years where we had the Regen Network deal beginning of this year, but we also had quite a bit of interest in soil carbon coming up in Australia last year, bubbling up to the surface. And people really started to want to know how their soil carbon was changing, but also what the current status of soil carbon was. And so our software sets up to solve that. It's a very simple software solution. We provide a mobile app to help collect a sample and submit it to a lab paperlessly. So at the end of the day, the soil tester gets all the results mapped back onto a farm, either their clients, if you're an agronomist or a carbon developer or carbon project manager, or for the farmer themselves if they just wanted to upload all of their historic data. And that's been really interesting, right? And it's interesting, and we'll just jump into the economics now. And I think that's sort of the introduction done around where we're seeing this data being used and how people are monetizing carbon offsets and ecosystem services. So in Australia, we're quite fortunate. We've had the government has legislated the market since about 2012. And I was talking to Richard about this earlier, right? So we've had this regulated method for how from how you draw out the project boundaries, generate the sample locations, to how you convert those into a total tons of carbon estimate for the entire landscape after you've done the soil tests. And then that legislation goes through the entire project, so that they stipulate when you have to resample next. They also stipulate the price that you can sell the credits for, because you're ultimately selling the credits back to the Australian government. Now, it's been it wasn't successful. So it's been around since 2012. It hasn't been hugely successful until last year, really, when we started to see a major uptick in soil carbon projects. The major challenge, and I think the reason for that lack of success really came back to the lack of data, and the question that kind of people like Travis are answering, which is, what can I do to increase soil carbon, or realize these ecosystem benefits, and what's the effect it has on my day-to-day operation? Because most farmers, before they enter these projects, they know how to farm, but carbon farming is it's got to be thrown into the mix alongside productivity. And so they're a little unsure, at least in the Australian context, on what the effect of increasing soil carbon for the sake of generating carbon offsets is going to be on their on their profitability and their productivity, which has been a really interesting thing, right? And this is where data, I think, comes into play, because if you can start to, before you even think about a carbon offset project, as a land manager, as a rancher, as a farmer, if you can start to link up changes in things like soil carbon and soil nutrients more broadly over time, you start to bring the soil biome in with what your pasture biomass is starting to look like. You can start to at least get a bit of a feeling through the data on what is going to work, what isn't, and what practices are going to work for you. And I think as we move forward, understanding these practices is going to be really, and the effect that they have in the different regions and different environments, noting that Australia has very different soils to the US as well. I mean, we have pretty much zero rainfall in the middle of our country. So most of our regenerative agriculture takes place on the East Coast, and compared to the US, which I think is as much better performing soils in general. So from an ecosystem services point of view, two ways of doing it. We've got the carbon offsets, the regulated carbon market here in Australia, which is now being supplemented through private marketplaces in the US, which we love. Like, we are, the Regen Network deal has just been fantastic, because it's encouraged much more farmers to take a bit more of a risk, see the potential here and in what they're already doing. And these are farmers that are already regenerative farmers that understand what practices need to change. And so having these marketplaces where you just monetize carbon offsets directly has been absolutely brilliant. Ultimately, it's come down to the actual data sets collected to be able to prove that change. Now, I'm segueing, and I'll lead quickly into sort of the next theme, because some of those practices, if you've got 2,000 acres and you take 3 soil samples and you want to use that to generate carbon offsets, it's probably not going to be the most accurate result there. And under most legislated markets and even voluntary markets, it may not be enough to prove that you've got X amount of carbon CO2 sequestered throughout your soils, right? So we start looking into this accuracy thing. We start getting into the spectrum of really accurate measurement versus not so accurate measurement. Now, really accurate measurement is really good because when it comes to selling carbon offsets as a financial product, the buyer is like, well, I trust, they can really put a lot of trust, or the market can put a lot of trust and emphasis on, how that carbon offset was sort of shown and generated. And we've been talking to Kevin a lot in terms of the big carbon methodology, which is a very measurement-based approach and ultimately very, quite accurate in terms of the carbon offsets it generates.
So what's a good measurement? Like for you, how do you do the measurement? Like what's a good approach there?
In the Australian context, it's soil sampling down to minimum 30 centimeters. Generally, we have 2 layers, so 0 to 30 centimeters, but then almost always they'll look to go as deep as they can. And then they take the mass of soil, they send it off to a soil testing lab and get the percentage carbon and work out the total tons of carbon by interpolating that across the area. And then they need a minimum of, usually they do what's called stratify the farm. So you create, so you take your 2,000 acres and you split it into, let's say just three strata for the sake of simplicity. So you divide it into 3. Now, each of those strata you're usually looking to stratify in the context of carbon. So you want to make sure that each of those, 130, you have the lowest third of carbon in your farm as one boundary, one strata. You have the middle third, and then you have the upper third. And what that does is just keeps the variance very small. So it keeps, when you take 3 samples across that area, it means your samples are being between, say, 1 and 1.5% within the low carbon zone, 1.5 and 2% in the medium carbon zone, and 2 to 2.5% in the high carbon zone, right? And you want that because that demonstrates accuracy. At the end of the day, you're only taking 3 samples across 2,000 acres. And so, when you work out, all right, well, a sample is like, maybe that big and that deep, how reflective of soil is the bit I'm getting analyzed? And this is always the challenge with soil sampling, is how much soil do you need to take to get an accurate figure? Well, these are some other tricks and methods you can use to decrease the variability and improve the accuracy, right? But and certainly we are moving to, this is great for regulated markets, but there's also this opportunity, especially for smaller landholders. We're talking regenerative farmers with less than 100 acres or less than 200 acres, right? Where, hey, and the cost of going out doing the baselining, entering these programs, it's just not, it's just not there. It's not proven as yet because sampling costs are high, labor costs to actually do the sampling is high, and then they have to invest in the infrastructure and everything to make the changes in accordance with the project. And this is where we start looking at carbon insetting. And carbon insetting, and this is, I think, a good segue into maybe the next chat, is more of a marketing exercise than it is a carbon offset generation. The generation of carbon offsets. You can do so with a lower standard of accuracy. You still want to be able to prove that you're changing, that you're increasing carbon, but you can do so under we've worked with clients that are kind of doing it under their own rules, still doing it scientifically, still proving it, but it's not as accurate as the regulated market here in Australia, right?
What's insetting?
So let's dive into that now. So what an insetting project looks like versus an offsetting project looks like is you go out, you make those regenerative changes, or you may have already made them, and this gets across the issue of additionality. Have you guys heard of the term additionality? So when you enter one of these projects, you have to do something additional to what you're doing today to actually generate the carbon offsets, or else you can't just rely on the climate. which in Australia has a massive effect on carbon offsets, right? Now, the challenge there is, what if you've been a regenerative farmer for the last 20, 30 years? And this is a real challenge, because you've already got your soil carbon up to a really good standard. And this is where carbon insetting can come in and start to be used as a marketing tool, but also as to demonstrate to the market that you're doing the right thing. So we're talking sort of a lower level of accuracy, still some soil testing involved, or at least proof and evidence of those management practice changes. And then we introduce things like benchmarking, right? So we've done some work here in Australia around looking at the things like indicators of good regenerative practices and well-performing soils. Things like, well, one of the tools we use is ground cover. And so we look at satellite ground cover is great because you can look at satellite history back. We pull reports back to sort of 30 years or so to look at changes in variation in ground cover. Then we can look at farms in a 100-mile radius and say, all right, well, here's how you're performing in relation to these farms. You're at the top 10% of farms or ranches in the region compared to the 160-mile radius that we've got in terms of ground cover. And that can then be used to take into the branding, into the marketing of the product being provided. And that's where the carbon insetting thing is insetting. We're actually not generating these carbon offsets to sell on a private market, where the ranch or the farm is generating them and then, generating the evidence and the proof and then putting that into the product. And I'll pause there because I think that's probably a good segue to the next conversation there, Kev.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely a good point. I think, with regenerative producers, you can either try and find a way to work within the ag value chain, or you can sell these ecosystem services outside of it. And I don't think anyone has a clear answer on what comes next. I do recognize, we're like 40 minutes in. I have plenty of questions I want to ask and I have lined up, but I just wanted to stop in case anyone had any questions for an experienced regenerative producer. I'm an investor myself, or someone that's worked on, dozens of carbon grazing projects and really is deep in the data side of things. Yeah.
I do have a question about the economics piece. You mentioned that you could increase or double, triple the stocking rate, and that would be advantageous for the farmer because they're generating more money per acre. That would be if those farmers were originally just doing grass-fed, right? If they were doing some sort of feedlot, like, pretty soon, like they have the cattle, they graze the cattle, and then they send it to a feedlot that doesn't necessarily tolerate, right? And pardon my ignorance, I'm from the tech world, I'm not a farmer.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. I was specifically referring to grazing perennial grass pastures. Yeah. So there's three ways to increase profitability typically on a farm, and you could argue that there's more small ones, but one is reduce your overheads. Number two is reduce your direct costs. That's very hard to do because you can't starve a profit into a business typically. And then three is increase turnover. So when you increase your stocking rate 2 or 3-fold, you can increase your turnover significantly, right? And turnover typically has one of the largest effects to your bottom line. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question for Travis too. What's the role of processing in this space? I guess Will just kind of asked. Is there mobile processing units that are available enough?
You see Kevin and I grinning ear to ear here.
Talked about it before.
you just asked like the $100 million question. So
you need more?
No, I don't think we need more processing necessarily. I would actually disagree with that stance. I think there's plenty of processing capacity in the United States. I would I don't want to get too philosophical either, right? Because it's sort of like we overproduce beef right now by a massive amount. We overproduce every commodity in this country by enormous amounts. And what do we do with this overproduced commodity? We flood the global market with it. We inhibit other countries from building their own sustainable food systems because we're dumping our crap on the world super cheap. So the whole like we need more processing is not a valid point really. Here's the bigger issue when it comes to how regenerative grazers fit into this equation, or grass fed, even if we want to go on that step further, right? Or just small producers in general. So there's really 3 tiers of processing. You have your small custom processors. Those can sometimes be state exempt. Sometimes those can be USDA exempt. I would typically classify those as like 50 to 100 head per week in capacity, okay? So we're talking very small, usually family-owned type of companies that have been generational and run by relatively few employees. Then you have the next tier, which is about 100 head per day or 1,000 head per week, okay? Now, those are the types of processors that work with your people who are entry-level commercial scale packers, right? So Wholesome Meats, for example, one of our companies, my sister company, who I work very closely with, that's where we're at, right? And it is extremely difficult to get spaces, and it's extremely difficult to find quality workmanship because the industry has extremely high turnover and all sorts of human resource issues, just like everything else in agriculture, okay? And then you have your third tier, which are like your JBS facilities, your Tysons. They process anywhere from 1 to 3,000 head per day. The biggest facilities that I know of do 4 to 5,000 head per day. There's only a few of those in the world. So the space that's missing, that's really needed for regenerative or even grass-fed in the United States specifically, to move forward is those mid-scale processors, because they're a stepping stone, right? They're a stepping stone to growing your business, to scaling up. Because when you're talking about building one of those mid-scale processors, that's a $50 to $100 million plant.
Mm-hmm.
Because you got to realize, I mean, processing, just like other businesses, is going to lose money for 3 to 5 years before you become solvent and start actually paying back your investors and, you know, getting a real ROI. So you're going to need operational cash, not only to build an extremely expensive facility, but you're going to need operational cash for 3 to 5 years. So this is something that Soilworks in particular is tackling head on, because we realize that it is a extremely huge bottleneck for what we're trying to achieve.
Is there different licenses or permits that are needed? Or is there a specific license or permit that is needed for that level of facility?
No, the only thing in particular that those facilities do that the lower level custom processors don't do, beyond your federal, you know, USDA regulations, they have audit processes that the little guys just don't really need to participate in. And those are typically like a food safety audit, like a B. There's one called SQF, and the other one I think is BRQ. And those are typically, I may be getting those acronyms wrong actually, but those are typically the two that any major retailer or wholesaler nationwide are going to ask for in a facility, and you are only going to find those at that level of processing.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, I've got, thanks guys for being here. I've got a quick kind of macro question. Just in kind of looking down the road, how can regenerative grazing shift the balance of cattle that are produced kind of on feedlots versus on pastures? And I guess, what are you predicting in the next 20 years, how that's shifting?
So shifting into grass-fed producers or regenerative producers and sorry, I was...
Yeah, no worries. So I guess if we just think of all the beef and all the dairy that's produced in the US, it's split between grass-fed and, regenerative cows and also feedlot cattle. And I guess, do you think, the proliferation of regenerative technology, or, or also these carbon credits, is that going to shift more cows out of feedlot systems towards regenerative systems?
Well, to be clear, all cattle start in a grass-fed system. Okay.
Yeah, right.
So, in other words, a cow-calf producer, they all start in a grass-fed system on range land. I'm gonna call it range land. Let's not call it a grass-fed system, right?
Yep.
They're on range land. And so that actually is the largest set, okay, if you're looking at the statistics, that's
right.
The largest set of producers in the world, okay, is cow-calf producers. Then they move into your stocker grower phase. That's after weaning. They're typically sold by these cow-calf producers. The cow-calf producers are typically small landowners. Those are like your 400 acres or less land farms in the United States. Your next level is the stocker grower phase. Those are typically still raised on grass pastures, but they begin to background them on feed. Okay. Those often are going on to like wheat pastures during the winter in the Midwest and northern tier of the country. In the southern tier of the country, we put them on oat pastures or perennial grass pastures where we get year-round growth, right? Then the last 90 days of their life, they go to a feedlot, right? I would love to see all animals leave a feedlot, just from a moral standpoint for myself, on a personal level, right? But the reality is that there are a lot of people on this planet, especially in the United States, that love eating a good corn-fed steak because it's beautifully soft, and it's where our palates are trained to it, right? They've been trained to it for almost 100 years now. So getting everybody in the dining industry and at HEB or wherever you guys shop at, Kroger, to switch from corn-fed, grain-finished beef to grass-fed is not going to be an easy thing to do because it's a whole different eating experience. I think where the greatest impact can happen, though, and this is kind of where you were leading with your question, is with these cow-calf producers and these stocker grower finishers. These are the land managers, right? The people that are affecting the most land mass. I think carbon credits is probably one of the only chances or hopes that we might have of getting these people to switch to a more regenerative grazing system. And the reason sorry.
Yeah, no, because I want to add something else there as well, Travis, which is because we've seen this a lot in Australia, and we've got some clients, not just in regen ag, but in the other place. There is another problem that we need to solve here, I think, Alex, which is providence. How do consumers know where their meat comes from? So, producing meat is one thing, and we can look at it from an industry perspective, produce the cheapest meat as much as possible, very low margins, et cetera, and this comes back to Laurie's sort of question there, because we've got a few of these companies here in Australia now just starting up, mobile abattoirs. The benefit of a mobile abattoir is you don't dilute the meat when you send it off to the to the big abattoir, big processor, and we cannot underestimate the importance of this when it comes to getting meat to the supermarket and being able to say hand on heart where that meat came from. Now there is another challenge there in saying this meat was grass-fed throughout its life. Like that's a separate part of the challenge. I mean, we've got to solve the supply chain challenge first, because then the supplemental challenge is how do we prove that before that cow went to be processed, what were the conditions it grew up on? Was it purely grass-fed? Now, I don't think this is going to be, I agree with you, Travis, I don't think it's going to be a mainstay of the market. I think it's not going to have a big impact on carbon sequestration initially anyway. But if we can provide that to the consumer, at least we can give the consumer the option to drive, the type of meat they want. And through those consumer signals, we should see an increase in regenerative agriculture later on down the line. But there's all these, we're finding, at least in Australia, it's a relatively small market, there's all these challenges to overcome in determining that providence. It's starts, I think, with the mobile abattoir, and sort of ends with the consumer. But being able to understand the life of that cow is super critical.
Yeah. I mean, just kind of take this to a broader approach, and then I think Kirk has another question. There's some accelerants that need to happen on the ranch economics and with consumer, essentially one, consumer education, and two, consumer, willingness to pay a higher price. But there's also some hard caps that we need to consider. One is land use. You need more land to have a truly regenerative operation. And you also need a lot of education of the people on the farm. And that's going to be a generational change. I mean, I think I've said this so many times in the past week, but like, what is it? A third of all lands is going to change hands, and farmland is going to change hands in the next 10 years. Like, what does that mean? Is it going to be replaced by folks that are younger, that are more open to change, and a different paradigm of agriculture? And honestly, it's also a very old paradigm of agriculture. I think that needs to be recognized, that people were doing very similar practices centuries ago.
That's kind of where I was going with what I was just saying last, was that not only do we need a consumer that's willing to change, right, and be educated and buy a different product. That's a hard one to tackle just within a second. But we also need farmers to change. And you want to talk about people that are absolutely entrenched in their ways. It's going to have to be a generational shift to a large extent. And that's why I believe, though, I mean, I've said this for a lot of years, that the carbon credit marketplace has the potential to create that change, because money talks in this business, just like every other business. So.
Yeah, no, and also, Laurie, that's a funny comment you made about, or is it just going to be people who have no idea what they're doing? There's plenty of people that attend a training or two from like one of these super cool, like regenerative ranching camps, and they do it. And the truth is their ecosystem isn't attuned to what they learned, because the person that was teaching them comes from a very specific environment, or they don't have the data available, and they're not using necessarily the right tools. So, that is a real problem. But I do think that that's a surmountable one, as, I guess, like a standardized, as this knowledge becomes more accessible and there's better peer-to-peer networks available. But yeah, Kirk, you have a question?
Yeah, this one's for Sam. Talking about things that don't make money, but nitrogen in the soil. Has anyone with regenerative farming nitrogen, right? You should be able to lower it. Is there any viewpoints on nitrogen being available, since it's a huge greenhouse gas and the under-talked? I know carbon markets obviously have a valorization, but what about nitrogen, or anything, your thoughts on that?
We've spoken to a few scientists. So there is an optimal level. So if anyone's familiar with the carbon-nitrogen ratio in the soil, there is an optimal ratio of carbon to nitrogen, and you don't actually want to have too much carbon compared to nitrogen, or else things don't work, and you don't get those benefits through the microbiome, because nothing's actually sort of moved. There's too much rock in the soil, right? But we know that most of these regenerative practices have a good influence on that carbon-nitrogen ratio if they're kept in balance. But again, it's sort of about testing, and it's about the soil type you're starting with and other bits and pieces. Ultimately, I think your question there, Kurt, comes down to the stimulated microbiome, because it's the biome that will, nitrogen is like, 80%, 90% of the Earth's atmosphere, right? It's the most abundant gas there is. The question is how, and we haven't had synthetic fertilizer before 1919, right? So how do we survive without adding nitrogen to the soil? Well, we had soil biome. So I think the question is more, how do we stimulate that biome? And I think the challenge with measurement approach is that we're still very wrapped up in wet chemistry, right? We haven't really moved into the biology space, and there's not a lot of labs out there that are testing soil biome, because, and I think Travis, you mentioned it, like we know, there's millions of species of different, like things in the soil out there. We know about 10,000 of them, and that really emphasizes just the fact that we are only just scratching the surface in terms of understanding how to sequester, how to stimulate that. Because I think once we crack that nut there, Kirk, we're going to know, all right, what the not just about the ratios, which is the chemistry of the soil, but what we need, what biome needs to be stimulated in the soil, and when a regenerative process is working for a specific region based on that biome being activated. Yeah.
I guess with Travis, then I guess as just one follow up on it is, does that nitrogen? I know you're a cattle ranch, but as far as nitrogen, it feels like is there a wedge there to be a value proposition to a farmer as far as collecting data? And then I know carbon has its obvious market, but nitrogen is such an important metric for any farmer. It feels like if you can build
specifically for
some value, row crop, yeah. Okay.
I mean, when it comes to rangelands, which is most of the world, right? Most of the world's landmass.
Yep.
That has nothing to do with rangelands. So we're talking specifically about crop production when it comes to nitrogen. And my challenge would be is that's just a matter of getting people to switch to a different source of nitrogen, because the nitrogen problem comes from the type of nitrogen they're putting down. I mean, if you go to like Africa, to the rangelands in Africa, the species to grass, like nitrogen fixers to grass composition, is like 90%. It's incredible. And it's the most productive grasslands on earth, right? Because it have all these massive megafauna that are still there. And in the United States, like if you come to one of my ranches here in Texas, in South Texas, we're on a good year, our nitrogen fixer to grass ratio is like 10 to 1 maybe at best, so, and that's specifically more of a row crop issue. And I agree with you. I think that there is technology, but it's not going to be technology from like a piece of software. It's going to be the development of mechanisms like microbes, and applying those to the soil. So the specific microbes that help take the nitrogen from the atmosphere and give them to the plant is where I see that really coming together. And there's some chemical concoctions, some natural concoctions that they're putting together, such as, like algae. They'll mix it with the microbes and they'll put like fish emulsion in there and molasses and put that on the soil. And it's like you're getting that microbiology. It's like a massive jump start to it. And that's typically what you see on like rangelands, but they're also using those applications primarily in row crop and vegetable production, mostly vegetable production, because it is costly at this point. And your higher ROI is on vegetable crops. So that's where you see most of that technology, and the development of it is emerging in the vegetable marketplace.
I had a quick question, if that's okay with everyone.
Yeah.
I guess, Travis, I'm curious, like you mentioned, one of the big challenges is like capital intensiveness of the business. I guess, like, what is the forms that like are most like bothersome in, like, say, starting a new business or transitioning to regenerative? Is it land? Is it fencing? Is it other kinds of infrastructure like processing? And I guess, like, I'm not sure if we ever really, you said there's plenty of processing. So does that mean like processing shouldn't be a part of the picture and it just needs to be like certified differently? Or I guess both of those questions that I'm interested in.
Well, the processing space, I wouldn't worry about that so much. Okay, look, buying the cattle. Okay, let's go buy 5,000 head of calves. We're talking about a $5 million investment, right? And that's just for one ranch. That's not much land mass, Well, let's talk about scaling up to 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 head of cattle. That's a drop in the bucket. There's something like 30 million cows just in Texas. You're talking extremely large sums of money just to scale these things. That most people in the agriculture space just don't have access to. They just don't
And so like banks won't fund that, or you can't get kind of lower risk funding for any of that.
They'll loan it to you at 8%. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
Not with the low margin business. It doesn't work. That works for like, tech where your, returns are in the 100 percentiles, ours are, and a really good operator can do 20%, 30% gross margin. I can do 40, close to 40 on a good year, So, and then your conventional operators, they're lucky if they make 2 to 5% gross margin. That's about like a restaurant. So it's, and I mean, there's all sorts of things that are capital intensive, but I would say the biggest one, the biggest capital expense is going to be buying the livestock. Always is. But you can be creative about it, right? You don't have to be the owner of the livestock or the land, et cetera. I mean, there's all sorts of creative ways of getting into the ranching industry, and that's for whole other big discussions. But
Like it was
I know I didn't answer your question directly, but it's a hard question to answer. I mean, where does the capital need to go? I guess that's really what you're asking, right? Like, where does the capital need to go in this space?
Yeah, if I was like, I have 100 million, where should I put it to make this happen?
That is a really good question.
That is a good question.
That's a good question because it's such a complicated space, and that's hard for me to wrap my head around, like where it really needs to go, because there's so many issues.
I think, look, my view is consumer education, hands down. And if you can do that through tracking, because let the market drive what the industry does. And if you can educate the consumer, you can get the consumer driving, based on, what they know about carbon, et cetera, et cetera. I think if you educate the consumer, the rest will come.
That's what farmers say often. Tell me what to grow and I'll grow it.
Yeah.
I remember speaking with a different regenerative grazer in Australia, and something he brought up that was interesting was that the consumer can probably drive a lot of it. However, like ultimately the most amount of beef that's going to be consumed in China and Russia, and generally they don't really care what the meat comes from as much. So I think like as a total like consumption of all beef in the world, like people who are willing to care and can pay to care is probably going to be less than 10%. So just a thought anyway. I thought it was interesting that they brought that up.
Well, I think it's going to be baby steps, right? I mean, what we've got to really understand too is that we're at the very tip of this. I mean, this is just beginning, right? So this is early adoption, whether we believe that or not. We're early adopters in the space for the most part. What was that old English Navy captain that said real change takes about 200 years to happen? The first 100 years is just getting used to the idea, and the next 100 years is actually like expounding upon that, getting used to it, and boy, if he isn't right for most things on this planet, I mean, it's the honest truth. We tend to think of things, especially in the world as fast as it moves now, that they can change so rapidly, but we're talking about agriculture here. Agriculture works. It takes years just to get a calf to the right size for someone to eat, so it takes a whole year for a crop to grow, etc.
So real quick, I just wanted to jump in because we're just past the hour. It's been phenomenal conversation. Again, Kevin, thanks for getting this going. Please keep going, but also guys, as people drop off, Travis, Sam, if you want to post your contact info, your websites or link, whatever you'd like, so people can get a hold of you, please throw that in the chat. I'm sure there'll be some interested folks in chatting with you. Sam, I know I want to learn a little bit more about the Australian carbon market because you guys are doing things a little differently on the rules down there. But anyways, keep the conversation rolling, but I just wanted to make sure that people could contact you. So carry on if there's more questions, please.
Yeah. Also, I want to talk a little bit about what Lori said here about I'll just read it out loud. I hear what you're saying about the C market being a catalyst for behavior change, but I also worry that there could be a backlash because there will be so much data collected and so much changes in practice. And then there's a payment of like $3 an acre and it won't pencil out for the farmer. You're totally right. Yeah, I mean, that's a big risk right now because the unit economics don't necessarily work out. Something I've thought about is transition financing. Like, should it be a loan structure? I know Mad Agriculture is doing wicked cool work in Colorado, and easier access to capital. But there really isn't an accepted break-even price for farmers and ranchers. But I don't know. I think now it's at least it's an attractive investment option for the folks that can afford to kind of invest in those changes and then wait for the prices of soil carbon credits in particular to appreciate. But yeah, I don't know if Travis or Sam have any particular thoughts on that, or anyone else.
I would say my challenge would be how can we, we talk, we've heard several times tonight, okay, how can we get consumers conscious about buying better products, right? How can we get consumers conscious about the carbon credit marketplace and the power of change that it can have? Like what if we start, the way that we put nutritional mandates on labels, what if we start putting carbon mandates on labels about, and I'm not saying we mandate it, but voluntarily saying, hey, this product is putting this much carbon into the environment. This product is taking this much away. That's, there's a lot of ways to educate the consumer beyond where their beef came from. I would challenge Sam, his comment earlier about where challenging the consumer to where their food comes from. I've been in the retail food space for 13 years now. And that's a hard battle to fight right there. It is very difficult to get people to think about giving a darn about which farm their cow came from and what that farm was doing. The price is typically one of the biggest factors when a consumer walks up to a shelf of whether or not they want to pick up that product. I think there's a lot of creative ways, even beyond what I just mentioned, that I'm not even thinking about, where we can get the consumer thinking more about what they're picking up at the grocery store and being interactive with them.
Hey, Travis, kind of along those lines, isn't something happening in Europe now where they're requiring import goods to be full valued or true costed at the point of retail so that the carbon footprint of that product is on an equivalent playing field to what the European regulations are requiring?
Yeah, I read something about that recently.
Yeah. I thought that was super interesting because at the end of the day, if we're subsidizing that hunk of beef that's flown in from Brazil, there's no way it can compete, even with a conventional.
No way.
And so if the true cost of that beef is there, so.
Yeah, that's a big thing. It's called cool labeling, country of origin labeling.
Yeah, exactly.
And like when that stuff got repealed, there was no chance because essentially if you pack it in the US, even if it's coming from a foreign country, it'll still count. Like they can still say made in the USA. So that the fact that the FTC is tackling that extensively right now is wicked cool.
Cool just got reinstated, by the way.
Sorry?
Cool just got reinstated this last week.
Yeah. Thank God. But it's still a new concept. I feel like there's still going to be so much legal funging around. And Sam, I'm sorry that, in Australia, I feel like, the ANZAC countries do export a lot of beef to the United States. So I'm actually curious if you have a different perspective on that.
No, it's a real issue. It's really impacted our wheat and cotton and barley exports to Europe because now, as a wheat farmer, Chuck got a bunch of synthetic nitrogen, and nitrous oxide is 298 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So, we've got massive issues with our overall environmental footprints, and the European thing is really, it's been really interesting. So actually, this is again provenance, right? Like, because the buyers over in Europe we need to now show the buyers that, farms are doing the right thing. So, one of our one of the case studies one of the clients we're currently working with is a client called Good Earth Cotton. So these guys are a giant, big, fat cotton farm outside of about 4 hours west of where we are, and they're probably one of the largest cotton farms in Australia. They export a lot of cotton, but they've just decided to go completely carbon neutral through both soil carbon sequestration, but also don't forget the other side of the equation, which is mitigating their on-farm emissions. So reducing things like synthetic fertilizer, replacing it with composts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, with this is really interesting because with our help with the carbon soil testing data that they've got, we've helped them sort of map their soil carbon results, not to the Australian regulator standard, but again, carbon insetting style. They've been able to prove to the Europeans, European regulator, that they have a carbon neutral or at least close to climate positive product to be able to export over there. And they've been able to elicit a premium. I think, I'm trying to think of what I know the overall cost per bale they ended up selling it for was $110 per bale, and I think that's near on sort of twice the amount we usually get for cotton over to our European buyers, because they've had that rigor in the background. So which has been interesting, but definitely affected us and just the focus. I mean, if anything, I think we are seeing change in consumer sentiment. They are more interested in climate, friendly products, but it's carbon friendly products, but it's just, it's how that manifests to them, whether it's through the pair of jeans they're buying, through the meat, or just, it's just there through the market activities. So I do have to apologize, guys. I've got to jump off.
Yep, I've got to do it as well, Sam. So I was going to do the same thing.
No worries. No worries.
Hey,
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me, Richard.
Thanks for joining. And Kevin, big round of applause to all three of you for taking over today and teaching us a lot. So it's great.
Yeah, awesome conversation, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Travis, for the.
Sorry.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks y'all for coming. And Travis and Sam's gone, but thanks for the discussion. Also I'll put it in the group, but if anyone has any questions or anything, feel free to reach out on the Work on Climate Slack.
Awesome.
Yeah. And stay tuned in the channel real quick. I think next week's probably open forum. I have a guest lined up for September 8th. More to come on that. So throw any thoughts, ideas, notes, comments, articles, whatever in the chat. Try to keep it going. Thanks again, guys. I got to run as well. All right. Ciao.
Cheers. Thanks, Josh.